The Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 19, 1944. 0700 hours. The German assault had come in the night, fast and violent, exploiting the fog and the cold and the shock of the offensive that the Americans had not seen coming. Hauptmann George Brandt's infantry company had overrun 3 American positions in 6 hours. Textbook work, the kind of night assault the Wehrmacht had been executing since Poland. By first light, his men were consolidating inside a cluster of farmhouses that the Americans had been using as a rear bivouac area. A supply point. A rest station. Somewhere safe until 45 minutes ago. His soldiers were moving through the buildings with professional speed, cataloging what they'd found. Ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies. The usual archaeology of a position abandoned in a hurry. And then, from the largest farmhouse, one of his sergeants appeared at the door and called for him with an expression that was not the expression of a man reporting on ammunition. Brandt walked inside. The field kitchen was still warm. Not the embers of a fire. Not a pot of cold stew. A functioning American field kitchen, recently vacated, with meals still in the insulated Marmite containers stacked against the wall, sealed, hot, untouched. Scrambled eggs. Bacon, fried potatoes, coffee, real coffee in a separate container, still at temperature. His men had been on iron rations for 4 days. They ate, all of them, everything. And then several of them, their bodies so conditioned to inadequacy that abundance had become a physiological shock, became physically ill. Brandt stood in the farmhouse doorway and looked at his men and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only from the evidence directly in front of you, that he was fighting a war against people who ate like this in the field. We've now covered 7 of America's most unlikely weapons: Spam, K-rations, candy, instant coffee, Coca-Cola, a floating ice cream factory, and a field kitchen that served roast turkey under artillery fire. Each one tells the same story in a different flavor. Hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in America's most unlikely war machine. The story of what happened to Brandt's men in that Belgian farmhouse is not an isolated anecdote. It was documented in various forms across multiple engagements of the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive of the Second World War, launched on December 16, 1944, through the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Operation Wacht am Rhein had been planned in secrecy for months, assembled through a logistical effort that stripped the Wehrmacht's remaining mobile reserves to their bones, and launched into the specific gap in the American line where the front was thinly held and the terrain was considered too difficult for major armored operations. For the first 48 hours, it worked. American units were overrun, surrounded, or forced into chaotic retreats. The 6th Panzer Army drove deep into the Belgian countryside. German soldiers, many of whom had spent months in defensive positions on inadequate rations, found themselves moving through territory that had been, until very recently, the rear area of a well-supplied American army. What they found there changed something in the way they understood the war they were fighting. German military planners had expected to find the usual contents of a military rear area: ammunition, fuel, equipment. What they found, consistently and in quantities that defied their expectations, was food. American food. Not emergency rations, not the preserved, calorie-dense but joyless provisions of a military force operating at the edge of its supply chain. Prepared food. Hot food in insulated containers designed specifically to keep it at serving temperature during transport from a field kitchen to the front line. Scrambled eggs. Stews. Roast meat. Coffee that tasted like coffee. The Gulaschkanone, the Wehrmacht's famous field kitchen, a horse-drawn or vehicle-mounted cooking unit that had been Germany's primary method of feeding its soldiers in the field since the First World War, was a machine built for a specific philosophy of soldier feeding, that a soldier needed calories, delivered hot when possible, and that the apparatus for delivering them should be rugged, mobile, and simple. The Gulashkanon was genuinely excellent at this. Could cook while moving. It could serve hundreds of men in rapid succession. It was a proven piece of equipment with decades of operational history, and German soldiers had an affectionate relationship with it. The nickname Gulashkanon was itself a term of rough endearment, the kind of name soldiers give to things they depend on. What it could not do was what the American field kitchen system was designed to do: maintain meal quality across the full distance between the kitchen and the soldier eating it, through the insulated Marmite container that kept food at serving temperature for hours, provide genuine variety through the M1937 field stove's capacity to fry, bake, roast, and stew, reach toward the forward line in conditions, artillery fire, air attack, contested terrain, where the Gulashkanon's dependence on a fixed setup position and visible smoke chimney made operation tactically dangerous. That chimney was the Gulashkanon's fundamental vulnerability. The stovepipe that gave it its silhouette, and its nickname, since it looked vaguely like a cannon, was also a beacon. Smoke rising from a field kitchen position was an artillery target marker. German field cooks had developed practices for minimizing the signature, but the basic physics of a wood or coal fire in an enclosed unit were not amenable to full solution. American field kitchens, burning liquid fuel with engineered efficiency, produced a smaller and more dispersed smoke signature that, combined with the pit and sandbag concealment practices that American cooks had been trained to use, made the American field kitchen position significantly harder to spot and target than its German equivalent. In the attritional warfare of 1944 and 1945, this difference was not trivial. A field kitchen that can be identified and destroyed by enemy artillery is a field kitchen that stops feeding soldiers. The American system's relative resilience to this threat, physical and tactical, was a direct product of design decisions made in peacetime by people who had asked and answered the question of what it would take to keep a kitchen operational in a genuine combat environment. And behind all of this, behind the equipment and the containers and the stoves, was a philosophy. The question of what a soldier at war deserved to eat was, in the American military, answered differently than it was in the German one. Not in the narrow sense of calories or nutrition, though the caloric picture was also favorable to the Americans. In the deeper sense of what food means, what it says to a man when it arrives hot and varied and competently prepared in the middle of a war that is trying to kill him. It's as, someone thought about you. Someone planned for this. You are not expendable. Brandt's men understood this, in the farmhouse, in the most visceral way available to human understanding. They understood it through their stomachs. The American field kitchen system that Brandt's men encountered had been assembled over several years of deliberate institutional effort that began, as so many American military innovations did, not with a general's inspiration but with a researcher's question. The question, posed by the Army Quartermaster Corps in the late 1930s as part of the broader modernization of American military logistics, was deceptively simple. How do you get a hot meal to a soldier who is too close to the enemy to be served from a stationary kitchen? The German answer to this question was the Gulashkanon, and the German answer assumed that the soldier would, in most operational situations, come to the kitchen. The kitchen would be positioned as far forward as safe operation permitted, and the men would rotate through in groups during intervals between engagements. This was a sensible system for the kind of war the Wehrmacht had been designed to fight. Fast, decisive, spatially bounded. When the front was moving rapidly, the field kitchen could move with it. When a position was stabilized, it could be set up properly and operated efficiently. The problem was that modern industrial warfare, particularly the kind of attritional combat that characterized the Western Front from mid-1944 onward, did not always cooperate with this model. Artillery fire, air attack, and the fluid front lines of mobile operations created conditions in which sending men back to a stationary kitchen was tactically impossible for extended periods. And extended periods without hot food were not merely uncomfortable. The relationship between hot food and sustained combat effectiveness had been studied with increasing sophistication by American military nutritionists through the late 1930s and early 1940s, producing a body of evidence that gave the Quartermaster Corps clear operational guidance. A soldier who has eaten a hot meal performs measurably better over the subsequent 8 to 12 hours than one who has not, in reaction time, in decision-making quality, in resistance to the specific kind of psychological deterioration that military medicine was beginning to call combat fatigue. The American solution had 3 components, each one addressing a different part of the problem of getting hot food forward. The first was the M1937 field stove, a liquid fuel cooking unit of considerable versatility that could fry, bake, stew, and roast, that ran on the same fuel available through the military supply chain, and that could be operated by trained cooks under field conditions that would have made civilian kitchen work impossible. The stove was designed with specific attention to the problem of concealment. Its fuel combustion produced significantly less smoke than wood or charcoal alternatives, and American field cooks developed the practice of digging a shallow pit for the stove and stacking sandbags around it to further reduce the thermal and smoke signature visible to enemy observers. Some cooks stretched tarps above the cooking position to disperse rising heat. Others operated at night, timing cooking cycles to coincide with periods of reduced enemy observation. The ingenuity was not in the equipment alone. It was in the trained human beings operating it under conditions that the equipment's designers had anticipated and that the cook's training had prepared them for. The second component was the insulated Marmite container, a large, sealed, thermally insulated vessel that could receive food directly from the field kitchen and maintain it at serving temperature for a minimum of 4 hours during transport to forward positions. The Marmite was not a sophisticated piece of engineering by modern standards. It was, in essence, an insulated box with a tight-fitting lid. But its operational significance was profound. It severed the link between the location of the kitchen and the location of the soldier eating. Food prepared several miles behind the line, in a position safe enough to operate a stove, could be transported forward through contested terrain, delivered to soldiers in forward positions, and served hot. The kitchen did not need to come forward. The food did. Runners, jeeps, and, in the most extreme situations, soldiers crawling through exposed terrain under fire were all documented methods of Marmite delivery during the European campaign. The Americans had created a logistics system for hot food that was, in operational terms, parallel to the system for ammunition, something important enough to deliver under fire, by whatever means necessary, because arriving without it was not an acceptable outcome. The third component was the people. American Army cooks were trained soldiers, not formally in the infantry sense, but in the practical sense that their role was understood to be operational rather than merely domestic. They were expected to maintain kitchen operations under artillery fire if the tactical situation required it. They were expected to exercise judgment about concealment, timing, and delivery routes in ways that a civilian cook in a commercial kitchen would never be asked to exercise. The Army Quartermaster training program for cooks included not just culinary instruction but field craft, how to set up and camouflage a kitchen position, how to operate under blackout conditions, how to maintain food safety standards in field conditions that made normal hygiene practices impossible. These men were not famous. They did not receive the recognition that went to infantrymen or fighter pilots. Their names do not appear in the operational summaries of major engagements. But they were present at every one of those engagements, working behind the line, solving the daily problem of hot food with the same combination of training, improvisation, and stubborn commitment to outcome that defined the American approach to every logistical problem of the war. Corporal John Stone of the 85th Mountain Infantry Regiment, 10th Mountain Division, described the reality of American field cooking in Italy, one of the most operationally demanding environments of the European campaign, in terms that illuminate the gap between the institutional commitment and its daily execution. His kitchen crew, he explained, typically set up more than 5 miles behind the advancing line. They dug holes in the ground for the field stoves and stacked sandbags around them to reduce their thermal and smoke signature. They prepared hearty, hot meals, meat and potatoes type of meals with any vegetables available, and sent them forward in Marmite containers through terrain that had been under artillery fire within the previous hours. When his division soldiers returned from fighting on the front lines, Stone recalled, they entered the feeding line with the specific relief of men who had been promised something and found it waiting. It was a break from the C rations and K rations, he said. The fellows really liked it. This is, on its surface, a modest statement. The fellows really liked it. But embedded in that modest statement is the entire operational logic of the American Field Kitchen program. The men expected it, they received it, and the gap between expectation and delivery was small enough that what they felt was not gratitude but satisfaction. The specific, quietly powerful satisfaction of a promise kept. The philosophical contrast with German field feeding doctrine could not be sharper. The Wehrmacht's approach to soldier nutrition had been designed, from its Prussian foundations, around the principle of sufficiency. A soldier needed enough calories to fight, delivered reliably enough to maintain physical function, in a form robust enough to survive the logistical conditions of the campaign. The Gulaschkanone fulfilled this mandate with genuine engineering elegance. It was mobile. It was durable. It could cook while moving, a capability that the American kitchen system, dependent on setup and fixed positioning, could not match in conditions of rapid advance. What it could not do was serve Thanksgiving turkey. And yet, in November 1944, as the Hurtgen Forest campaign was grinding American units down in some of the most costly attritional fighting of the European War, with the forest consuming men to cold injury and artillery fire at a rate that made November one of the bloodiest months of the campaign, American field kitchens were preparing and delivering roast turkey to soldiers in forward positions. Not to every unit, not under every set of conditions, but as a documented institutional effort, resourced and executed, to provide soldiers on the most savage front of the autumn campaign with a meal that connected them to a specific annual civilian ritual of gratitude and family and abundance. Roast turkey. In the Hurtgen Forest. Under artillery fire. The Germans, who heard about this through intelligence channels and through the testimony of captured American soldiers, did not know whether to be impressed or appalled. Several German officers in post-war testimony described the turkey story with the same mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration that ran through German encounters with every American logistical achievement. It was, one said, the act of a military that did not believe it was losing. He was correct. It was exactly that. German officers examining captured American field positions in the Ardennes and elsewhere noted, with varying degrees of explicitness, the evidence of this system. Insulated containers, multiple fuel canisters, cooking pits dug with engineering care. The remains of meals whose variety and caloric content exceeded what German supply was providing to its soldiers in similar operational conditions. Intelligence assessments compiled from these observations tend toward a cautious, professional register, the language of men trained not to react emotionally to evidence. But between the lines of those assessments, the same recognition that Brandt experienced in the farmhouse is legible. The Americans had solved a problem that German military logistics had not recognized as a problem requiring this level of solution. They had decided that hot food was worth this level of effort, and the effort had been made. The arithmetic of the American Field Kitchen program is, like all the arithmetic in this series, a wall of evidence that the qualitative story alone cannot fully convey. The scale of the Cook Corps. The United States Army employed approximately 200,000 trained cooks and food service personnel across all theaters of the Second World War, a figure that represents a dedicated human commitment to the feeding mission that had no precise equivalent in any other army of the era. These were not soldiers who cooked in addition to their primary duties. They were soldiers whose primary duty was cooking, trained, evaluated, and assigned to the food service mission with the same institutional seriousness that the Army brought to its infantry training program. The ratio of trained food service personnel to combat soldiers in the U.S. Army was, by most estimates, substantially higher than in the Wehrmacht, which relied more heavily on unit-level improvisation and less on dedicated, trained specialists. The M1937 field stove. Each standard American field kitchen was equipped with multiple M1937 liquid fuel stoves, capable of producing a combined output sufficient to serve between 150 and 180 soldiers per kitchen setup. The stove's multifunction capability, frying, baking, stewing, roasting, gave American field cooks a range of menu options that translated directly into the kind of meal variety that sustained morale over extended periods. The German Gulaschkanone, by contrast, was optimized for a single cooking method, the one-pot stew that gave it its nickname. It was excellent at what it did. What it did was limited. The Marmite delivery system. The insulated Marmite containers used by the American Army were manufactured in sufficient quantities to equip every company-level unit in the European and Pacific theaters simultaneously. Their 4-hour temperature maintenance capability was tested and documented under field conditions, and delivery protocols were established that specified how far forward a Marmite could be transported in what time window to guarantee food arriving at safe serving temperature. This was not informal knowledge passed between experienced cooks. It was doctrine, written, trained, and enforced. The Battle of the Bulge food evidence. The Battle of the Bulge provides the most dramatic documented evidence of the gap between American and German field feeding. German soldiers who overran American positions in the Ardennes in December 1944 consistently found hot food in quantities and of a quality that shocked men who had been living on reduced iron rations for extended periods. The physiological reaction documented in multiple accounts, German soldiers becoming physically ill after consuming American field rations because their digestive systems had adapted to chronic undernutrition, is a medical phenomenon known as refeeding syndrome in its extreme form. The fact that American field food was rich enough to induce this response in German soldiers is, in clinical terms, a precise and irrefutable measurement of the gap between what the two armies were eating. Turkey in the field. Perhaps the most resonant single data point in the American field kitchen story is documented practice in the European theater. American field kitchens, operating in forward positions, served roast turkey to soldiers on Thanksgiving 1944, while the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest was actively consuming American casualties at a rate that made the month of November one of the bloodiest of the entire European campaign. Hot turkey. Under artillery fire. In a forest that was killing men every hour. The field kitchen kept cooking. The food kept arriving. The promise was kept. The psychological significance of a hot meal in a combat zone is, on one level, self-evident. It is warm, it tastes better than cold rations, and it provides a brief interruption of the sensory deprivation that sustained combat imposes on the human nervous system. These are real effects, and they are sufficient on their own to justify the logistical investment. But the deeper psychological mechanism is the one that runs through every episode of this series, and it operates the same way here that it operated with the Coca-Cola bottle and the instant coffee packet and the ice cream barge. It is the mechanism of the promise, and the specific psychological weight that a kept promise carries in the context of military service. The United States Army had, through its published field manuals, its quartermaster training doctrine, and the accumulated institutional practice of its food service corps made a commitment to its soldiers. We will get you a hot meal, twice a day, wherever you are, whatever is happening. Not as a luxury, not contingent on favorable conditions. As a baseline expectation of your service, as fundamental a part of the contract between soldier and institution as your ammunition and your medical care. This commitment was not always fulfilled. No logistical commitment survives contact with the full chaos of combat entirely intact. There were days when Marmite containers arrived cold, when kitchen positions were destroyed by shellfire, when supply chain disruptions meant sea rations for a week. The soldiers complained about these failures with the same vocal, passionate eloquence that American soldiers brought to every complaint about military life. But the complaints were possible precisely because there was a standard to fall short of. The expectation existed. The promise had been made. When it was broken, both sides of the transaction knew it had been broken. The German soldier had no equivalent standard. Not because German commanders did not want their men fed well, many of them did, and the Gulaschkanon represented a genuine institutional commitment to soldier welfare within the constraints of German military doctrine. But the standard was different. The expectation was more modest. The promise, if it existed at all, was a softer one. We will feed you when we can, with what we have, in conditions that permit it. That difference, between a hard promise and a soft one, between twice a day wherever you are and when conditions permit, is not merely a logistical distinction. It is a statement about what the institution believes its soldiers are worth. And soldiers, who are acute readers of institutional behavior because their lives depend on correctly interpreting what the organization around them intends, understand this statement with a precision that no official communiqué can obscure. Corporal Ernst Müller, a Wehrmacht infantryman captured in France in September 1944 and held in an American prisoner of war facility in Virginia, described in a post-war interview his experience of American field food, encountered first in the form of hot meals served in the POW processing facility, and later through the testimony of American guards whose conversations he followed with the improving English of a man who had time and motivation to learn. What struck him, he said, was not the quality of the food in absolute terms, though the quality surprised him. It was the expectation he observed in American soldiers, the absolute, unquestioned assumption that hot food would be there, that its arrival was not a piece of good fortune to be grateful for but a routine entitlement to be annoyed about if it was late. They complained when the coffee was cold, he said. I had not had real coffee in 2 years. They complained when the coffee was cold, because cold coffee was below what they were owed. I thought about this for a long time. He thought about it because it told him something that the tactical situation, the production statistics, and the casualty figures had also been telling him, in their different languages, that he was fighting an army whose government had decided its soldiers were worth more than his government had decided its soldiers were worth. That decision shows up in artillery production rates and aircraft output and shipping tonnage. It shows up in the blood bank and the instant coffee and the ice cream barge. And it shows up in a Marmite container of hot scrambled eggs, still warm, found in a Belgian farmhouse by men whose bodies could no longer process abundance without breaking down. The strategic consequences of the American field kitchen advantage were, like all the logistical advantages in this series, distributed across the full arc of the war in ways that resist simple attribution to any individual battle or campaign. What can be said with confidence is this. The sustained operational tempo that American forces demonstrated across the European and Pacific theaters, the ability to mount successive offensive operations at a pace that German and Japanese forces consistently found difficult to match, was underwritten, in part, by the sustained physical and psychological condition of the individual American soldier. And that condition was maintained, among other means, by the systematic provision of hot food in conditions where other armies had accepted cold rations as inevitable. The connection between nutrition, morale, and operational tempo is not theoretical. It is documented in the American military's own internal assessments, in the after-action reports of commanders who identified soldier welfare as a factor in unit effectiveness, and in the negative evidence of what happened when the system failed. The Hurtgen Forest Campaign of October through December 1944, in which American units were committed to grinding attritional combat in terrain that made normal supply almost impossible, produced casualty rates from cold injury, trench foot, and psychological breakdown that military historians have attributed, in part, to extended periods without adequate hot food and dry clothing. The units that maintained field kitchen operations closest to the line, that kept the Marmite containers moving despite the conditions, performed measurably better over the campaign's duration than those whose food service collapsed under the operational pressure. The Battle of the Bulge provides the sharpest strategic illustration of what the field kitchen advantage meant in practice. As German forces drove through the Ardennes in December 1944, overrunning American positions and consuming the supplies they found there, they were simultaneously exhausting their own logistical reserves at a rate that their supply chain could not sustain. German soldiers who ate American field food in captured bivouacs were, in many cases, eating their last hot meal for days or weeks. The offensive's momentum was partly sustained by captured American supplies, a fact that Wehrmacht logistics officers noted with a mixture of professional satisfaction and grim recognition. An army that advances by eating its enemy's food is an army that has already acknowledged, implicitly, that its own supply chain has failed. American forces, meanwhile, reconsolidated, resupplied, and counterattacked, fed, throughout the crisis, by field kitchens that kept operating in temperatures that fell below -15 Celsius, in positions that were sometimes under direct fire, by cooks who had been trained for exactly these conditions and who understood that their job was not to cook when conditions were favorable but to cook regardless. The last major German offensive of the war was contained, and then reversed, by men who were cold and tired and frightened and, by the standards of the American field kitchen system, fed. Hot food had not won the Battle of the Bulge, but he spent the remainder of the war in a British-administered prisoner-of-war facility in England, and the years following it in the slow, effortful process of rebuilding a life in a country that his generation had broken. He returned to his pre-war profession as a schoolteacher in a small town in Baden-Württemberg. He taught history, which required him to teach the war, which required him to find a language for what he had experienced that was adequate both to the facts and to the young people sitting in front of him who had been born after it was over. He found most of the facts easy enough to teach. The dates, the battles, the strategic turning points, these had the clarity of established record. What he found difficult to teach, he said in a letter to a former colleague in the 1960s, was the thing he had understood in the farmhouse in December 1944. The thing that the hot scrambled eggs had told him, in a language more direct than any intelligence assessment or production statistic. I try to explain to the children, he wrote, that a war is not decided only by who has more guns. It is decided by who has made better decisions about what their soldiers are worth. The Americans had decided their soldiers were worth a great deal. You could see this in everything, in the medicine and the equipment and the food. Especially the food. Because food is the most daily thing. It is 3 times a day, every day, regardless of what else is happening. If you want to know what a government believes about the men it sends to fight, look at what it feeds them. Look at whether the food is hot. Look at whether someone has thought about how to keep it hot on the way to the front. The Americans had thought about it. We had not thought about it enough. This is not a small thing. This is perhaps the whole thing. This is perhaps the whole thing. An army is not a machine. It is a collection of kept warm the men who did. And there is one final element of the field kitchen story that belongs in any honest account of its strategic significance, one that the numbers and the doctrine and the Marmite containers do not fully capture. It is the element of demonstration. Every time a German soldier encountered an American field kitchen, in a captured position, in a prisoner of war facility, in the testimony of comrades who had passed through American-held territory, he was receiving the same information that Brandt received in the farmhouse and that Corporal Muller received in the processing facility in Virginia, and that every German officer who read the intelligence assessments received in his headquarters. He was receiving evidence that the enemy had made a decision about its soldiers that his own army had not made. That the American government had looked at the question of what a soldier in the field deserved, and had answered it with institutional resources and doctrinal commitment and engineering ingenuity and 200,000 trained cooks. That evidence accumulated. Each encounter added to the weight of a conclusion that, by 1944, was becoming impossible for honest German observers to avoid, that they were not fighting an army that was improvising or lucky or temporarily well supplied. They were fighting an army that had been designed, from its foundations, to sustain its soldiers better than any army in the history of warfare. An army that cooked turkey in the Hurtgen forest, and kept Marmites moving under shell fire, and fed its men hot eggs in a Belgian farmhouse on the morning after an artillery barrage. The field kitchen kept cooking. That was the message. That was always the message. Hauptmann George Brandt was captured in late January 1945, as the German lines collapsed under the Allied counteroffensive that ended the Battle of the Bulge and began the final push toward the Rhine. Human beings who must eat 3 times a day, every day for as long as the war lasts. How those meals arrive, whether they are hot or cold, varied or monotonous, delivered by a system that has thought about the soldier or improvised by one that has not, is not a footnote to the military story. It is the military story, told in the language that every human body understands without translation. The field kitchen kept cooking. The Marmite kept moving. The food kept arriving hot, at the forward line, under artillery fire, in the dark. That is what it looks like when an institution decides its soldiers are worth the effort. And that decision, made in kitchens and quartermaster offices and training manuals years before the first shot was fired, was one of the 10,000 reasons the Americans won.